Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey Herman and Corn, so do you remember that episode where you told me that I'm caring for Ezra and I'm sick, that I should be using a KN95? Well, here I am. I'm wearing an N95, so I hope you guys can hear me through the mask. Don't ever say I don't listen to Herman Poppleberry's wise words. I have a question for the two of you today. This is a fairly simple one, I hope. But we were talking about Singulair in a previous episode. Singulair is a Montelukast is a chemical name. Leukotriene, right? Leukotriene receptor antagonist, and used in the treatment of allergic asthma. I started it during the mold saga, because I figured that until we had a resolution, I may as well, for safety, because now I realize I'm part of the Ezra care team and I gotta really take care of myself. So I started it, and one thing I've always wondered about Singulair is that we read that it takes like 2 weeks, or sometimes it says in the box a month even, but I think generally 2 weeks to reach maximum effect. So my question is the following: if Singulair works by taking this inflammatory mediator leukotrienes and it blocks them from binding, why doesn't it start working immediately? Why do we sometimes see, especially for allergy drugs, this kind of a downstream process whereby you have to take it consistently for a certain number of days and then it reaches so-called maximum effect? I mean, I guess we could ask the same question about SSRIs and other drugs, but I read about that before, that serotonin levels take a long time to affect. Oh! So let's talk about just Singulair today. It's such an important drug for many suffering from asthma and allergies. What's the delayed onset? This whole world of inflammation and allergies, I know, is really called an inflammatory cascade. There's a lot of different layers to it. But why is it that when we step in at this layer, we take a while to see the actual resolution of symptoms? Over to you two.
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. I am Corn, and I am here with my brother, as always, Herman Poppleberry. It is February 14th, 2026, so happy Valentine's Day to those of you celebrating, though I suspect our favorite listener, Daniel, is currently having a much less romantic time dealing with a house full of mold and a sick toddler.
Herman Poppleberry here, and yes, happy Valentine's Day. Though, in the spirit of the holiday, I suppose we are talking about the heart of the respiratory system today. Corn. I heard Daniel's audio prompt earlier, and I have to say, I am really glad he is finally taking our advice about the N95 mask. Dealing with mold remediation while caring for a sick kid like Ezra, especially when you are already feeling under the weather yourself, is a recipe for a total immune system meltdown.
It is the responsible move for sure. But it is also classic Daniel to be sitting there in a high-filtration mask, probably feeling a bit congested and exhausted, and his mind immediately goes to the pharmacokinetics of asthma medication. He sent us a great question about Singulair, or Montelukast, which is the generic name. He is wondering why it takes about 2 weeks to really kick in. If the drug is designed to block receptors, why isn't it like a light switch? You take the pill. It hits the receptor. You stop wheezing. Why the 14-day lag?
It is a brilliant question because it touches on the fundamental difference between chemistry and physiology. We often think of drugs as these little magic bullets that just stop a process in its tracks, but the human body is more like a massive, slow-moving ocean liner. Even if you cut the engines, that ship is going to keep drifting for miles before it actually comes to a halt. In Daniel's case, his engines have been running at full throttle due to that mold exposure, and he's asking why the brakes feel so spongy.
I love that analogy. So, let's set the stage for everyone. Singulair is what they call a leukotriene receptor antagonist. For those who might not be familiar with the term, what exactly are we talking about when we say leukotrienes?
Right, so let's look at the inflammatory response. To understand the drug, you have to understand the villain. Leukotrienes are fatty signaling molecules, part of the eicosanoid family. They were actually discovered back in the late 1970s by Bengt Samuelsson, who eventually won a Nobel Prize for this work. When your body encounters an allergen like the mold Daniel was dealing with recently, or pollen, or even just cold air in some people, your immune cells go into high alert. Specifically, cells like mast cells, basophils, and eosinophils start pumping out these chemical messengers. One group of these messengers is called cysteinyl leukotrienes. You can think of them as the high-decibel alarm bells of the respiratory system. When these leukotrienes are released, they travel to specific receptors, mostly the cis-LT1 receptors on the smooth muscle of your airways and on the cells that produce mucus.
And when they hit those receptors, that is when the trouble starts, right? It is not just a simple itch.
Oh, it is much more aggressive than an itch. They cause the airway muscles to tighten up, which is bronchoconstriction. They cause the tissues to swell up with fluid, which is edema. And they tell the goblet cells to start overproducing thick, tenacious mucus. It is a triple threat that makes it significantly harder to breathe. In fact, leukotrienes are estimated to be between 100 and 1,000 times more potent than histamine when it comes to causing that airway constriction. That is why an antihistamine often isn't enough for asthma. You need to stop the leukotrienes. Now, Singulair or Montelukast is designed to sit on those receptors. It acts like a key that fits into the lock but doesn't turn it. It just sits there so the actual leukotrienes can't get in and start the alarm.
Okay, so that makes sense. It is a blocker. But back to Daniel's point. If I swallow that pill, it gets absorbed into my bloodstream, it travels to my lungs, and it starts sitting on those receptors. That part happens relatively quickly. If you look at the data, Montelukast reaches its peak plasma concentration in about 3 to 4 hours. So why do doctors tell you not to expect full results for 14 days? Why the gap between the chemistry and the relief?
That is the crux of the mystery. If you look at the blood work, the drug reaches what we call steady-state concentration within just a few days of daily dosing, but the actual relief of symptoms lags behind. There are 4 main reasons for this, and the first one is what I call the existing fire problem.
The existing fire? You mean the inflammation that is already there?
Precisely. If you are starting Singulair because you are already having asthma or allergy symptoms, your lungs are already on fire. The leukotrienes have already been binding to those receptors for days or weeks. The tissue is already swollen. The mucus is already thick and clogging the smaller airways. But most importantly, the eosinophils, which are those white blood cells that specialize in long-term inflammation, have already migrated into the lung tissue in massive numbers. Singulair stops the signal for new inflammation, but it doesn't do much to clean up the mess that is already there. Your body has to naturally clear out that fluid and those cells. An eosinophil can live in the tissue for several days, and the remodeling they cause takes even longer to reverse. It is a biological process that simply takes time.
So it is like stopping a leak in a boat. Just because you plug the hole doesn't mean the water is suddenly gone. You still have to pump it out, and if the carpets are soaked, they have to dry.
That is a perfect way to put it. But it goes even deeper than just cleaning up the mess. There is also the issue of receptor turnover and what we call down regulation. Our bodies are incredibly dynamic. If you have been having a lot of chronic inflammation, your body might have actually upregulated or produced more receptors to listen for those leukotriene signals because the signal was so loud and constant. When you start taking a blocker, the body has to realize that the signal environment has changed and begin to adjust the number of receptors on the cell surface. This is a cellular remodeling process.
I think that is a point that most people miss. We think of our cells as static building blocks, but they are constantly recycling their parts. So you're saying the cell itself has to physically adapt to the presence of the drug?
Yes, it is a feedback loop. And then there is the third reason, the second-order effect on the immune cells themselves. One of the main jobs of leukotrienes is chemotaxis, acting as a homing signal for more white blood cells. It tells them, hey, come to the lungs, there is a fight going on here. When you block that signal with Singulair, you stop the recruitment of new soldiers. But you have to wait for the old soldiers who are already in the lungs to essentially retire or die off before the total level of inflammation drops to its new, lower baseline. This washout of inflammatory cells doesn't happen in a few hours, it happens over a week or 2.
That makes a lot of sense. It explains why it is a maintenance medication and not a rescue medication. I think that is a huge point of confusion for people. If you are having an asthma attack right now, and you take a Singulair pill, it is not going to do anything for you in that moment.
Nothing at all. For that, you need something like albuterol, which is a beta agonist. That works on a completely different timescale, seconds to minutes, because it directly affects the muscle tension. It is a mechanical fix, like physically prying a door open. Singulair is a chemical signaling fix. It is the difference between manually pushing a door open and rewriting the software that controls the automatic door.
You know, Daniel mentioned SSRIs in his prompt. Those selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors used for depression and anxiety. They have a famously long lead time, often 4 to 6 weeks. Is the mechanism of the delay similar there?
There are fascinating parallels, but the brain is even more complex. With SSRIs, you get an immediate boost in serotonin levels in the synapses, but the mood improvement doesn't happen for a month. The leading theory there is that the brain has to physically grow new neural connections or change the sensitivity of its receptors in response to that higher serotonin. It is called neuroplasticity. With Singulair, we are looking at something similar but in the immune system. We are looking at immunological plasticity. We are retraining the respiratory system's reactive state. We are teaching the lungs not to be so twitchy.
So, Herman, let's talk about the specific timeline. Why 14 days? Is there something specific about the 2-week mark in human biology?
It is not a hard rule for everyone, but 14 days is roughly the window it takes for several cycles of cell recruitment and clearance to happen. If you look at studies on airway hyperresponsiveness, which is the technical term for how easily your lungs slam shut when exposed to triggers, you see a gradual decline over that first 2 weeks. By day 14, most patients have reached a new equilibrium, where the drug is blocking the receptors, the old inflammatory cells have cleared out, and the body has stopped overproducing mucus in response to the old signals.
I wonder if there is also an element of the way the drug is metabolized. I know you mentioned it reaches steady state quickly in the blood, but does it accumulate in the lung tissue specifically?
That is a great technical point. Montelukast is very lipophilic, meaning it loves fat and membranes. It doesn't just float in the watery part of your blood, it actually embeds itself into the fatty cell membranes where those receptors live. This is good because it means it stays where it is needed, but it might also mean it takes a little while to fully saturate those specific tissue compartments in the lungs compared to just showing up in a blood test. You are essentially painting the inside of your lungs with this protective layer, and that takes more than one coat.
That is fascinating. So it is literally building a wall inside the cell membranes of your lungs over those first few days.
Exactly. And we should probably talk about what happens if you miss a dose, because this explains the maintenance aspect. Because of that 2-week buildup and the slow nature of cellular turnover, people often think, oh, I feel great, I can skip a few days. But because you are working against a biological cascade, once you let those leukotrienes back in, they can restart that fire very quickly. It is much easier to keep a fire from starting than it is to put one out once the eosinophils have been invited back to the party.
Right, so the maintenance aspect is about preventing the recruitment of those inflammatory cells. If you stop the drug, the signal goes back out. The homing beacon for the white blood cells turns back on, and you are back to square one.
Precisely. Now, I want to touch on something that I think is really important for anyone taking this medication, which is the nuance of how it works for different people. Not everyone responds to Singulair. There is actually a significant percentage of the population. Some estimates say up to 30 or 40% who are what we call non-responders.
Why is that? If we all have these receptors, why wouldn't the blocker work for everyone?
It comes down to genetics and the specific phenotype of your asthma or allergies. Some people have what we call eosinophilic asthma, where leukotrienes are the primary villains. For them, Singulair is a miracle drug. But other people have asthma driven by different pathways, like neutrophils or different cytokines like interleukin-5 or interleukin-13, which Singulair doesn't touch. If your house is flooding because of a burst pipe, and you spend all your time blocking the front door to keep the rain out, you aren't going to see much improvement.
That is a really important distinction. It goes back to that idea of personalized medicine. You have to know what kind of fire you are fighting.
Exactly. And there is a second order effect here that we have to mention, even though it is a bit heavy. The black box warning. Daniel mentioned he is taking this for allergies and asthma, but in March of 2020, the Food and Drug Administration added its most serious warning to Singulair about mental health side effects. We are talking about agitation, aggression, sleep disturbances, and even suicidal thoughts.
I remember when that happened. It was a huge deal because this drug is prescribed so widely, especially to children. What is the biological link there? Why would an asthma drug affect your mood?
This is where it gets really weird, and it actually connects back to Daniel's question about the delay. Leukotrienes aren't just in the lungs. We have leukotriene receptors in the brain too, specifically in the hippocampus and the amygdala, areas that regulate emotion, memory, and behavior. While the drug is designed to work on the lungs, it is small enough and lipophilic enough to cross the blood-brain barrier. If it starts blocking leukotriene signals in the brain, it can interfere with normal neurotransmission.
So it is the same mechanism but in the wrong place.
Right. And because of that 2-week delay in reaching maximum effect, these neuropsychiatric side effects often don't show up on day 1. A parent might start their kid on the med, everything seems fine for a week, and then suddenly in week 2 or 3, the child's behavior completely changes. Because of that delay, people don't always make the connection to the medication. They think the kid is just having a hard time or reacting to being sick.
That is a crucial insight. The lag time that Daniel was asking about isn't just for the benefits, it is also for the potential risks. You have to monitor yourself or your kids through that entire 2 to 3 week window as the drug reaches that steady state in the brain as well as the lungs.
Exactly. It is all part of that same biological ramp-up. You are changing the chemical environment of your body, and the body takes time to show you the full results of that change, for better or worse.
You know, Herman, thinking about this from a historical perspective, it is interesting how our approach to asthma has shifted. We used to be obsessed with just opening the airways, the rescue inhaler approach of the 1950s and 60s. But then we realized that the underlying inflammation is what actually causes the long-term damage. They call it airway remodeling, right?
Yes, airway remodeling is the dark side of chronic asthma. If your lungs are constantly inflamed for years, the tissue actually changes. The smooth muscle gets thicker, the basement membrane gets scarred, and you lose elasticity. This is permanent. You can't albuterol your way out of scarring. That is why maintenance drugs like Singulair or inhaled corticosteroids are so vital. They aren't just about making you feel better today. They are about preventing your lungs from physically changing into a less functional version of themselves 20 years from now.
So when Daniel is waiting those 2 weeks for the drug to work, he is actually participating in a long-term strategy to keep his lungs from remodeling. It is a slow process because the damage it is preventing is also a slow process.
That is exactly right. It is a war of attrition. You are trying to starve the inflammation of its signaling molecules. And you can't starve an army in a day. You have to cut off the supply lines and wait for them to run out of rations.
I love the metaphors today, Herman. The ocean liner, the fire, the army. It really helps visualize what is happening at a microscopic level. So, if we were to summarize the answer for Daniel, it is not just one thing. It is the time it takes to reach steady state in the tissue, the time it takes for existing inflammatory cells to die off, and the time it takes for the body to reset its own receptor sensitivity.
And the time it takes to clear out the physical debris of the previous inflammatory episode. It is a comprehensive biological reset, and I think it is a good reminder for anyone starting a new medication. We live in an era of instant gratification, but biology doesn't work on high-speed internet time. It works on the time of cell division, protein synthesis, and tissue healing.
It is a bit humbling, honestly. We can design these incredibly precise molecules that fit into specific receptors like a key in a lock, but we are still beholden to the slow pace of our own cellular machinery.
It really is, and it makes me think about other things that have that 2-week window. Like when you start a new exercise routine or a new diet, you don't see the changes in the mirror the next day. You are essentially doing the same thing, you are changing the inputs and waiting for the biological output to catch up.
That is a great point. The 2-week rule seems to be a recurring theme in human physiology. Whether it is a drug like Singulair or a change in lifestyle, that seems to be the minimum time the body needs to actually reconfigure itself at a meaningful level.
I agree. And for Daniel, specifically, while he is waiting for that Singulair to reach its maximum effect, keeping that N95 on is his best line of defense. because even the best medication is just a backup for actually preventing the triggers from entering your system in the first place.
Absolutely. Prevention is better than a block, but a block is better than a fire.
Well said. You know, I was looking at some recent research, specifically the Geno-Lung study from August of 2025 that actually looked at using AI to predict which patients would be non-responders to Singulair based on their genetic markers. They found that if they could identify these people early, they could skip the 2-week waiting period of a drug that wasn't going to work anyway and move them straight to something else.
That would be a game changer. Think of all the people who spend 2 weeks or a month on a medication, waiting for that relief that never comes, all while their lungs are potentially suffering. If we could skip that trial and error phase, it would save so much frustration.
Exactly. We are getting closer to that reality. But for now, the 2-week wait is just part of the process. It is the biological tax we pay for how complex our systems are.
So, Herman, what is the practical takeaway here for someone like Daniel or any of our listeners who might be starting a medication like this?
First, be patient. Don't judge the drug's effectiveness on day 3 or even day 7. You really have to give it that full 2-week window and sometimes even a month to see the true baseline it can provide. Second, consistency is everything. Because you are working against a biological cascade, skipping doses is much more detrimental than it would be with, say, a painkiller. You are trying to maintain a constant blockade.
And third, I would say, be a keen observer of your own body and mind. Like we talked about with the black box warning, the delay in effect applies to the side effects too. Keep a journal, or just be mindful of your mood and your breathing patterns through that first month.
Definitely. And if you don't feel a difference after 4 weeks, talk to your doctor. You might be one of those non-responders who needs a different approach. There is no point in blocking a door that the smoke isn't coming through.
This has been a really deep dive into something that seems simple on the surface, but has all these fascinating layers of biology and history behind it. I feel like I understand my own body a little better now, even though I don't take Singulair. Just that idea of the ocean liner drifting after the engines are cut. It's a powerful image.
It applies to so much, doesn't it? Inflammation is such a central part of almost every health issue we face. Understanding the lag and how we treat it is key to managing our health.
Well, I think we have covered the bases for Daniel. I hope he is feeling better and that Ezra is on the mend. It is a tough house right now, but at least they have a good supply of N95s and some interesting science to think about.
Indeed. And before we wrap up, I should probably mention that if you are out there listening and you find these deep dives helpful, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on Spotify or whatever podcast app you use. It genuinely helps other curious people find the show.
Yeah, it really does make a big difference. We love seeing the community grow. And remember, you can always find our full archive and a way to get in touch at myweirdprompts.com. We have covered over 600 topics now, so there is plenty to explore.
607, including this one. It is a lot of talking, Corn.
It is, but as long as Daniel keeps sending us these prompts, and you keep reading those research papers, I think we have a lot more to say.
I wouldn't have it any other way.
All right, thanks for listening to My Weird Prompts. We will be back soon with another one.
Stay healthy, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.